Hey guys, causes of the American Revolution are up to now. For the good of the group, make sure that you have your supplies, that you've signed up for a mind, and you've had somebody, parent or guardian, go ahead and fill out the parent contact link on my website. If not, make sure they're printing off a copy of the syllabus signature page. Me. Quiz alert! Quiz tomorrow, 1.1 and 1.2 English documents, and nighttime. If you want to sign up, make sure you do so immediately. Take notes tonight. There's a lot of information. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. So my suggestion is watch it first and then go back and take notes. But again, that's up to you. Make sure you have them for tomorrow's mental floss. Need to know basis. We're starting out with a lot of vocab. You can get why this is my second recording and the first one was 23 minutes long. So I'm trying to make it shorter. I'll have to take out some of my fun stories. So, the American Revolution, Navigation Acts, French and Indian War, Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, Lexington and Concord, Common Sense, Mercantilism, First and Second Continental Congress, and finally, the Declaration of Independence. Mercantilism is the idea that a mother country, in this case Great Britain, is going to establish colonies to make a profit for themselves. So the goal here is to export more than you import, or to, if you're in Britain, is going to be to sell the colonists more than I'm buying from them. So of course, the more money you make, the more power you have during. The Navigation Acts were set up in the early 1600s, and this was basically to say that all shipments had to go through English ports. Working out really well for the English, not so well for the colonists, because they couldn't trade with whomever they. The Albany Plan of Union from 1754, you might notice that this is a really common political cartoon from this time period. A lot of people think it's the American Revolution one. It is not. It's actually from the Albany Plan of Union. This is led by Benjamin Franklin. It was failed, but it was an attempt to be able to unite the American colonists around a cause which was supposed to be for defense against. The French and Indian War came up, and what ended up happening is that the colonists and the British were fighting against the French and the Indians. So the English won the war, and what better way to celebrate than to tax the colonists? So from the British perspective, the colonists were basically reaping the most benefit from this new land and this new territory in the United States and in Canada, and so they should be the people who pretty much pay for it through taxes. The Proclamation of 1763 occurred, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in class, but basically it said that the colonists were not allowed to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, the colonists' perspective, they said, look, whoa, hold on, we just fought in a war with you against the French so that we could have all of this land and all of this territory, and now you're telling us that it's right there at the Appalachian Mountains. It didn't make much sense to the colonists, but it was to ease tensions with the Native Americans. So we will talk a little bit more about this. Salutary neglect. This is the idea that the British ignored the colonists for almost 150 years, and the colonists were perfectly okay with that. They were actually good with it. They liked it. They liked it that way. So what ended up happening is they started their own governments. They developed their own ideas and ways of life and ways of thinking and ways of governing themselves. And so as early as the Mayflower, you see on the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims, before they even set foot on land, they decided they wanted to have some sort of law and a way of life that was already written, so they wrote the Mayflower Compact. The Virginia House of Burgesses was the first representative democracy in the colonies. So you can see that the colonists had already kind of set up their way of life, and the Stamp Act came. This is a tax on common goods, paper, stamps, cards, licenses, magazines, legal documents. And if you think about living in the 1700s, you're thinking about not making emails and phone calls and texting, and not having a television, an iPad, and a laptop computer sitting in front of you at all times. And so this idea of taxing these common goods was really essential to the way of American life and the colonists' life at this point in time. So the colonists decided and refused to buy these. So what they did was they came up with the Stamp Act Congress, and this is basically a union of 9 of the 13 colonies. They tried to get everybody. And this is the first attempt and real joining together of the colonies in order to kind of oppose some sort of British rule or policy. So Great Britain decided they were going to repeal and cancel the Stamp Act. 1 point to the colonists. They felt at this point. They started screaming, no taxation without representation. It was like their battle cry, right? So what they said was, look, if you want to tax us, then we better have some representation over in Parliament. It wasn't that they didn't want to pay any taxes. Although, you know, who really wants to pay taxes? But if you're going to tax me, then I need to have some sort of say-so in your government, in the British Parliament, and the colonists did not. Yes, the Stamp Act was repealed. However, it was just replaced with something different. Okay, these were called the Townshend Acts, and this was in 1767. So it only took them 2 years to say, okay, we take that first one back, let me give you a second one. Okay, and this is again a tax on a variety of different goods: paper, paint, lead, tea. All of these things were definitely important in the way of life in the American colonists. But the thing that really got the colonists at this point was the British customs officers can now search for smuggled goods on your ship. So they can board your ship without your permission, right? Search and warrant, things like that we talk about today. But they can go on without your permission, and they can look for smuggled goods or goods that you might be trading with somebody else other than, I don't know, Britain. Okay? So the colonists began for officials. What the king did was he sent some troops, and basically they lived here during times of peace and just in case of times of war, but mostly just in times of peace. And they started to kind of harass the colonists that were already here. Okay, so the British officers in the Boston Massacre fired into a crowd. Yes, it started with a snowball fight. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about this during class as well. But basically, it killed 5 colonists. When I hear the word massacre, I don't necessarily think of 5. Okay, I hear massacre and I think of probably more than 5, but you can take one word and just as the media does sometimes, it spun it. Okay, Paul Revere, if you know anything about this guy, he was most famous for a drawing that we'll look at again during class. And this drawing of Paul Revere basically was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was what a lot of people needed to join this revolution effort. Crispus Attucks was the first person to die in the American Revolution. He was an African American, and he was the first of the 5 to die at the Boston Massacre. So yes, this is 6 years prior to the Declaration of Independence and prior to us, actually declaring ourselves in a war. But the war had already. So the Tea Act, a lot of us know this story. The Tea Act would have actually made the colonists' taxes on tea cheaper. Okay, but the colonists were kind of fed up with all of this "you telling us what to do" nonsense. And so the Tea Act said that they could only buy from the British East India Tea Company. And yes, again, their taxes would have been cheaper, but they would have only been able to buy them from one company. I don't care if Harris Teeter is more expensive. If I want to buy my stuff there, then that is perfectly fine. That is my right. Okay? And so the colonists were having this. So what they ended up doing was having the Boston Tea Party. They didn't all sit around, and what they did was the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans, and they dumped the tea into the Boston Harbor in an act of rebellion. An act of rebellion against the Tea Act in particular. So work out real well for them in the long run. So what the British did was they passed these acts, okay? Now, the British called them the coercive acts. The colonists called them the intolerable acts. So you can see that there's a little bit of a slant here. We thought that they were intolerable. They thought they were just trying to make us do something. So that this is a punishment for the Boston Tea Party, and it closed down the Boston Harbor. So if you think about a way of life in Boston during this time period, most everything related to the Boston Harbor. So you're going to shut it down, and you're going to shut down a lot of business coming in and out of the colonies. It also banned town meetings. So you want to sit together and talk about how much you don't like the British anymore? Well, fine. Don't do it anymore. Okay? Quit having town meetings and we won't have to worry about that. It also restricted rights, okay, including things like the trial by jury. So the colonists no longer were able to have a trial of a jury of their own peers. It was a jury of one, and that was a judge, and that was actually a British judge or magistrate that was sent over from England, and so therefore they're not getting necessarily a fair trial, or at least they don't think so. They were also forced to quarter British soldiers. Now, if you think of quartering being something from like a movie that you've seen, it's probably not the same thing. Quartering during this time period was basically providing quarters or a place for the American people to live, and as well the colonists. the soldiers. Having a rough time. So the soldiers are going to basically move into a colonist home. They're going to provide them with nothing, but the colonists in return are supposed to provide supplies, a place to sleep, food for the troops. And so the colonists are looking at this and saying, hold on, the English government is being extremely... So they met. They had 1774. They knew they had to do something. Let's do something. So they met with the First Continental Congress, and they were going to demand that their rights be restored. So they wrote a letter to the king, and there's no better way, in my opinion, to get something done than to write a letter to a man that's an entire ocean away and wait for his response. Well, that's what they did, and they said, okay, we'll meet again. So, in between this time period, there was actually a battle, the first battle of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord. The colonists won this battle, and it was basically a battle because they were stockpiling weapons, okay? The British snuck up on them and didn't know what they were doing, and so they ended up in a fight, and it was the first battle of the American Revolution. You might have heard the term shot heard around the world, so everybody kind of stared at each other out there on the battlefield, and yes, you had to be on the battlefield. We'll talk about modern warfare and how that has changed. But the idea was that you had to look a person basically in the eye before you could attempt to shoot them, because of the ways that these guns were designed during this time period. It just didn't have the modern day advances. And so there was a lot of staring each other down. Somebody broke the rule of chicken and shot. So that's why it's known as a shot. So Thomas Paine is writing Common Sense during all of this, and he is basically kind of fed up with everybody's nonsense. He said, look, it's common sense. If you want to be free, be free. Quit complaining about it. Go ahead and separate from England, and let's get on. So the Second Continental Congress, again, the first one said, and we shall meet again. So they did. A year later, in 1775, they met again, and now they're trying to figure out, okay, look, this has gone too far. We're already actually fighting in a war. What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? So a lot of people had a lot of different opinions on what this was going to look like. You had some people who were loyal to Great Britain. You had some people who said, heck no, we're out of here. Let us do our own thing. What ended up happening is they eventually wrote the Declaration of Independence. It took almost an entire year for this to happen. Not the Declaration itself, but for them to get to the point where they would write a declaration. So it was signed on July 4th. Technically, it was signed on July 2nd, and then again on the 4th, and then some more people signed again later on in August. You know, we celebrate on the 4th, so we're going to write the 4th down. And it says the 4th on the official document. It was primarily written by Thomas Jefferson. He borrowed, and that's loosely stating, from John Locke and some of his ideas, life, liberty. And we had to have a purpose for this particular document. We had to argue the legitimacy of this war and why we were going to fight this war to Parliament. Okay, we wanted to tell them this is why we were doing it, this is what you've done to us, and this is kind of our retaliation for it. We also wanted to give the troops a boost to their morale. They've been fighting in a war that wasn't really a war because we hadn't declared a war yet. We needed something to fight for, okay, in the word of John Adams. So, also, to inform other countries, the American colonists probably would not have won this war without the help of France. And so what ended up happening was that we needed to inform other countries why we were fighting as well. France joined in on the action, and yes, revolution. So you can see the document here. We will do some in-depth study in class. This is John Hancock over here. He was the president of the Second Continental Congress, and you can see his beautiful signature right here. Thank you guys for sticking with me. I am in 13 minutes.